Hello, I'm Larry Johnson, and welcome to today's episode of Countercurrents. I'm pleased to have with me my good friend, Alastair Crooke, one of the best experts and analysts on events in the Middle East. If you like this broadcast, please hit the like and subscribe button. And thanks for listening. With all of the recent developments and the renewal of the genocide, and then Trump failing to learn the lessons that the Biden administration discovered, much to, I think, their chagrin, about Yemen being almost impossible to defeat. Where are we now with respect to going to war in the Middle East?
I think that we're on the runway, in brief. And I think we're on the runway because there is a delegation just arrived in Washington, led by Ron Dermer, and with Hanegbi and the head of the Atomic Energy Commission in Israel. And they're going to be doing the rounds of Washington to say that Iran cannot be allowed to drag this out. And they are saying, and it seems to be confirmed by everything we see that they are saying that there is an understanding with the United States, a formal understanding with the United States, that spring is the deadline, whatever spring means exactly. Mm-hmm. But they're saying spring is the deadline for making the decision. So what is that likely? Why spring? Why are we getting in this way? It's probably because the snapback provisions of the JCPOA expire in October. And if snapback were to be initiated, there is a procedure before that can go through, which is a little bit time consuming, but which is that there's a period allowed for, if you like, adjudicating whatever, whoever launches the process of resuming the UN sanctions in the UN of 30 days, I think it is. And then a resolution has to be put on the agenda, and that the sanctions will be renewed. And then it is, if that is turned down by Russia or China, then America can veto that. And then when sanctions are resumed, it's automatic. It's not the normal Security Council resolution. Mm-hmm. It is a thing that was devised by the Americans during the Obama administration that meant there was automaticity in it, that it couldn't be vetoed by the others. So that if that resolution is put on the table, then all UN states, signatories to the UN, are obliged mandatorily, because it will be a mandatory instruction of the Security Council, to impose sanctions on Iran, full sanctions, and sanction third countries that don't abide by it. So it would be both types of sanctions. So I think this is I think this is driving the timetable of the Iran attack, and we had it spelled out very clearly to us in I think it was by Waltz. What's going on last Sunday? Waltz boasted about the multiple Anglo-US airstrikes that took out top Houthi officials, making very clear that this was all about Iran. This, quoting Waltz, this was an overwhelming response that actually targeted multiple Houthi leaders and took them out. And the difference being between this approach and Biden's approach, he doesn't say that, but that's what it means, is one, going after the Houthi leadership, and two, holding Iran responsible for what happens. But this is, I think, the key, because there's some things that are if you like, underpinning American policy and thinking about at this moment. And one of them is that they were so impressed with the Israeli annihilation of Hezbollah's leadership,
right,
leaving them without leaders. And I think, secondly, they are agog at Syria. You know what happened? There wasn't a revolution. There wasn't an election. the door was left open to the shop, and the HTS walked in. Everything was left unlocked and on the shelves, and they took it. And there is a sort of, because of the huge propaganda machine in the US, I think there is a strong, albeit false, idea that Iran is going to be like Syria, and Iran will just, if you like, the leadership will be decapitated. So what they're saying is they're not going to go after the nuclear program, even they're not going to go after the oil and gas. They're going to just go for the IRGC leadership and the leadership of the Ayatollah and all of his associates, and leave it decapitated. And then they believe a pro-Western government will naturally fall into place. And so this will be easy. So I think this is, this as far as one can see. But I would underline, and I wrote about it in a piece, I think you get it on Substack.
Yes.
There is a serious planning going on in the US and preparations for an attack on Iran. And Trump just said it very a few days ago. We're down to the final moments with Iran, and it's going to be very soon. We can't let them have a nuclear weapon. Something is going to happen very soon. I would rather have peace deal rather than the other option, but the other option will solve the problem. So I think there's serious consideration. The Israeli team is already in place in Washington to sort of coordinate this. And that's the other sort of driving element in this. Israel is so deeply divided now, particularly after the sacking of the Shin Bet the head of the security services, Ronan Bar, and now the dismissal of the Attorney General. She has been dismissed. And the country, they are talking about now a strike, an economic strike, a division, a campaign of civil disobedience. It's not yet got to sort of violence, but it's getting very, very close to that. And so clearly, what do you do when your society is so severed in two? You start a war.
Yes.
You start a war, and everyone gathers around the flag, because then, bombs are flying and things like that, and they come back. So I think Israel desperately needs it. I mean, because, it thinks that if it can flatten, neuter Iran, then it will, then neutering Iran will solve all its problems, because they believe, like American leadership in Washington, that, Iran is behind the Houthis, behind the Hezbollah, behind Hamas, behind what's happening in West Bank, da-di-da. So they think this will be, the final solution to all these things. But so it has this sort of great push, and it's seemingly going ahead quite fast, unless it's delayed. But as I say, we seem to be in a process by which now Trump is relying, because it's very obvious that one of the things he was discussing, and he put it in a text with Russia, with Putin, was about trying to stop the nuclear. It was ill-defined about, Iran can't have a bomb, and I discussed that, and he implied that Russia was agreeing with him that, it's impossible for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. And that's what he said, but you don't find it. I looked carefully through the Russian account of that conversation, no mention of any agreement on Iran whatsoever. And I very much doubt there is an agreement on that, because the underlying document that Trump signed, which was this memorandum he signed just before Netanyahu came to Washington for that famous statement by Trump that Gaza was going to turn into the sort of the Mecca, the Riviera of the Middle East. Just before that, he signed this memorandum. He said he had sort of reservations about it. But the memorandum, which was drafted originally by Pompeo and others, is clear. It's not about the nuclear issue per se, the weapons issue per se. It says, first of all, that Iran cannot be allowed to have the capacity to move towards weapons. Now, the Israelis have all been saying, so it's not just about, enriched uranium. The Israelis have also been saying, we can't allow this technical knowledge to be passed on, that they've got that. The second thing was the Iran's defenses must be dismantled. The missile system has to be completely removed. And thirdly, its foreign policy has to be wound up. In other words, they want Iran neutered and naked. And I can't see anyone in Iran being able to sign on to that. And even if they said, oh, well, we'll just take the first part and we'll ignore the rest, I don't think there's no confidence, not enough confidence in the United States or Trump for that to happen. But finally, just to put the pieces in order, and then I'll stop. But the final part is that this process can also blow up Trump's normalization with Russia,
right,
very clearly, because whatever the relationship between Putin and Trump, and there's reason to believe, the two people do have some sort of chemistry together, even though they both pursue different interests, but they may have chemistry. But the real point is Putin has a constituency too. And the constituency will say, look, the Americans had an agreement with Iran. They walked away from that agreement. I mean, they, tore it up, the JCPOA, not the Iranians. They walked away from it. Now they say they want another one, and if they don't get it, Iran is going to be destroyed, dismembered. And they say, how do you do business with these people? Mm-hmm. I mean, they'll do the same to us. They did that after Minsk and everything. You think you're getting towards an agreement, and then so I mean, the sort of the political level in Russia, and I think this is why there's such a rush by Washington to get this deal by the Trump administration. Ceasefire. We must get this going. We must start now. We must really get this going. Let's talk about territory. Why? Because they're trying to triangulate Kissinger style with Russia. Let's do a deal with Russia, and then we'll sever their deal with Iran. On the basis, that Russia is just self-interested in its own interest. And they ignore the fact that, Iran sits on the north-south corridor, which is of vital interest to Russia. It also sits in the east-west corridor, which is of vital interest to both Russia and China for the development of trade in Asia. So, I think it's not going in a good direction. And I think that it could blow up, not only that, but they could blow up also the agreement. So the obvious question is, and this is what you can probably answer, not me, I've seen one after the other, every part of the sort of, I'm not talking about Witkoff, but all the team come up and say the same thing. We are totally behind Israel. We stand for Israel. No discussion, no debate, Israel. And then when I listen, and Kash Patel, head of FBI, was asked, what's his main policy priority? Support for Israel. What's that got to do with the FBI and Kash Patel? I mean, it's like a sort of great, everyone is obviously totally signed up to this, almost as it's sort of canon law, that this is the position, we're not going to deviate. Anything is just blind support for Israel. Even, I don't know if they're doing anything to try and understand what's going on in Israel. I don't know, but I have a strong feeling they don't understand it.
Are you familiar with the book by Michael Collins called Final Judgment?
Yeah, I'm afraid I haven't.
Okay, take that name down, Michael Collins Piper. And the book is Final Judgment. And what it is about, it's about the assassination of President Kennedy and the principal role that Mossad played in that. And why am I bringing that up now? Well, the Trump administration just released the JFK files, and lo and behold, what those files show, which a lot of people haven't, the deep state's been saying, nothing to see here, move along, shows that James Jesus Angleton was
the famous Angleton,
was working hand in glove with Mossad to circumvent President Kennedy's efforts to prevent Israel from getting the nuclear bomb. And at the same time, Angleton was involved with a program called Operation Red Cap, where they recruited young members of the U.S. military to become defectors to the Soviet Union. And one of those participants in that program was a young man by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald. So, and despite years of denying any connection, CIA or the CIA's line up to this point had been that, oh, Oswald was just he was involved with the Soviets. No, he was a tool of the CIA, and the base, they referred to a base in Nags Head, North Carolina, where Operation Red Cap was being run out. It was being run out of there. Well, it wasn't Nags Head. It's a top secret CIA facility which is in the vicinity, and I've been there, personally. Now, why I bring this up is the entire nefarious role of Israel and Israel's hooks into the U.S. political system date back now well over 60 years. And it was evident in that plot to kill Kennedy, and then in the effort to cover it up and to prevent anybody from talking about it. So now we jump ahead to today, where we have Trump's government is fully, completely captured by this Zionist entity. And did you have a chance to watch Witkoff's interview with by Tucker Carlson? Mm-hmm. I don't know which part shocked me more, but what came across was, and we get you to comment on this because you've been a negotiator. Here he is pretending to be a negotiator, yet does not meet with Hamas, does not talk to Hamas, does not deal directly with them. He's dealing indirectly with through a cutout, and clearly is buying into all of the Israeli lies about what happened on October 7th. So when you see that, you recognize the United States is not serious about a negotiated settlement with Hamas. And it is, as you rightly noted, Trump walked away from JCPOA, but Trump also walked away from INF. Trump should have no credibility with anybody in this process because he's broken every agreement, every deal that was on the table when he was president the first time.
Yes. If you spend a little time in Moscow, as I have, the history of the betrayals, is, very close to the mind of many of the elite in the political system. They have a long view. They don't take, we treat events as having no context and no history. And they take history very seriously, and they know history very well. And so this is why I'm saying, people said to me, but of course, but Russia will look after its own interests, and, Iran won't matter. I think what Colonel Macgregor said in his last talk about the presumptions underlying Washington's policy absolutely hit the nail on the head from my perspective. He said, first of all, that the Arab states are cowed and that the United States can just drive past them or drive them where they want, like sheep. Well, he didn't say like sheep, but he said drive them, okay. Secondly, the understanding in the Middle East is that when Israel and the US initiate a joint project together, it's virtually invincible. They can't stop it. They can't do anything about it. And the third premise that he said is, an attack on Iran and the rest of the world will probably just go along with it. He's not saying that's his view. He's just trying to underline why he thinks an attack on Iran is likely and the underlying presumptions in Washington. And I agree with him. I think those are precisely coupled with the two things that I said to begin with. One is, Syria, the sense, that Syria just collapsed like that. And the hope and the idea that's been cultivated that Iran is like that, and furthermore that its defenses are, there are the two narratives in Washington. One narrative is that, that the Israelis destroyed much of the air defenses and some of the nuclear program, and that, as I think it was that journal that comes on to Fox News every so often.
Jack Keane
came on and he said, Iran lies naked. It's staggeringly vulnerable. And this is, being portrayed and being said to be, this is the opportunity that can't be missed. We can change the whole Middle East at a stroke in this short period.
Yeah, and the period it's all over again. It's a cakewalk.
Exactly. And then the other narrative, of course, that it didn't happen like that at all. But that doesn't get so much traction in either Europe or the United States. So I think that, Russia is very, very cautious at this point. Anyway, there's been a really interesting statement by Putin in this last week. I don't know if you saw it. It was actually a speech to the Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. Quite an interesting gathering. But these are the real, this is the real economy of Russia. This is not, hedge funds and things like this. This is people who actually make the economy. And Putin essentially said to them in this, I thought it was quite striking, don't have any illusions, sanctions, restrictions on trade are today's reality. A new spiral of economic rivalry is being unleashed by the West. You should not hope for freedom of trade, payments and capital transfers. You should not count on Western mechanisms to protect your rights. What do I want to say to you, he said, to these group? I mean, these are the key people from all around the country, not just from Moscow. I'm saying our challenges exist, but theirs are so abundant too. We must acknowledge that even then Western mechanisms faltered. And he went on to say, and I'm just paraphrasing it, he went on to say, but it's something that interests me anyway, because I've written about it before. But he said, what is our solution? Our solution is to leave the model of global trade. The Western, this is the Adam Smith Anglo model of global trade, world trade as being the driver, and credit and debt being the supporting it. Move away from that and move towards having a largely self-sufficient internal economy, with a small proportion of that economy for trading globally with our partners, BRICS, with our BRICS. So he said, that's it. And then he underlined the other thing is, we are moving ahead with the financial and payment mechanisms. The BRICS pay system is going ahead. People think it may have been forgotten. It's not forgotten. It's going ahead. And he did say, and here I'm being very careful because this was in the closed session, and all we have is a commissant sort of pulling some things out from what delegates think they heard from Putin. But really, basically, he was, I think, saying that, what we've achieved, by force of arms can't be taken away from us. It won't be. And he said, what I said in June, I mean, effectively, he was saying, what I set out in June, if that had been taken then, yes, we could have had a ceasefire. Now we have moving on from that. And he said, but the point is also on the move. If the moment we're not claiming Odessa, but this point can move because they don't really have time to dig in. So, I mean, the whole of the essence of this was, I think, hugely important because he was really saying, and I want to underline this to your viewers and listeners, is he was saying, no, there are no carrots and sticks left in the Western hands. No carrots. Yes, I talk about investments because this is what the West wants to hear. And he says, we are moving. And he said, we're not even going to, oil and gas are not going to be the main part of our economy. They're an adjunct, yes, but our economy is going to be a real economy. He is going back to those authors like Friedrich List and Sergei Witte, who was the prime minister in Tsarist Russia, who always opposed Adam Smith and this globalist world trade vision and said, if you follow this, it's a disaster because sooner or later your economy will be so consumer orientated and away from manufacturing and production that you will not be able to employ all your people. It will be, the economy will be totally financialized and totally about consumption. They wrote this in the 19th century, saying, Adam Smith, wrong. And Sergei Witte was, as I say, a respected prime minister and author in Russia. And I think they're heading back to that sort of model. And it's also a model, by the way, that China more or less embraces this idea, of managing so you're not too subject to whatever's happening on the world in the world economy in terms of recession or whatever, because you have your own internal circulation of goods and services, and that can continue because Russia has all the resources and all the energy it needs for its own internal economy to go on. But, this is, I think, hugely important, the statement, because, the first thing it says is, Putin isn't in a hurry.
Right.
He's saying,
right.
I'm not, there's no pressure on me. I think, this is what the industrialists wanted to hear. They wanted to know, are we going to have to reorientate everything back to the West and have the West come in and take over our things? Where are we going? And he said very clearly, we're going east. Yeah. We're going to BRICS, and we're going to a different economy that's self-sufficient. We're not going back to the West. So, the idea that, Putin is going to be bribed by a nice offer of, sharing resources or a deal on Antarctica. Putin will do that if it's in his interest to do that. But the basic message is, we're not bribable. We're not subject to carrots nor sticks. You've put on us, I think he quoted the number, I don't remember it off the head, but we have something like 275 sanctions at the moment on us. And he said very clearly, he said, I don't actually remember the full details, but there was the sanctions called the Jackson-Vanik sanctions from the Cold War period on Russia. And he said, they were removed. Was it in the 80s? They were removed. And then what did we get? We got the Magnitsky sanctions.
Right.
And this is what he said to them. So as soon as they lift one, there will be others coming. So, this was the outlook of Putin. I think it's very important for understanding, this whole process. And there you have, the Trump team sort of trying to race on with, let's have an agreement, let's have a ceasefire, let's start talking about territory and division and everything. And I think it's because Trump is looking over his shoulder and thinking, let's do a triangulation with Russia and try and pull Russia away from Iran. But it won't be able to, even if it wanted to, Russia can't do that because, Iran is, ordinary Iranians, not the leadership of them, quite suspicious of Russia because of the history. And they're not going to give up their sovereignty. Yeah. And like, Trump is asking, disarm, remove it, end your foreign policy. You might as well ask them to go, why don't you retreat into a monastery and give up everything? And I don't see that Iran can do that, even, if it were sort of open to the idea. But, the question of some undertaking, which they already on the books, the fatwa by the supreme leader, we will not move to, well, what are we going to do? Build on that? Is that going to be enough for Trump? Well, the point is, it's not Trump, it's Israel.
Yeah.
Israel from the beginning drives the policy, drives what will be in that memorandum, drives what will be the conditions that will be set down for Iran to fulfill according to what the needs that Israel says it requires from such a deal. So, you're not going to have a nice, rational, I think, discussion and sort of clean little, outcome of certain undertakings by Iran that are acceptable to in that way.
What's so frightening is and I draw this conclusion based upon watching Witkoff. Now, I think Witkoff is a nice gentleman. He presents well. He seems to be, at least on the surface, a decent person. But the ignorance reflected in several of his statements and the assumptions undergirding a lot of those. The most egregious one with respect to the Middle East was his statement that Iran's air defense system is completely eviscerated. They're, again, the Jack Keane line, they're naked. And it's like, no, they're not. But the fact that Israel believes that, or at least the Zionists believe it, and now they've got Witkoff believing it, and Trump believes it. And I, for the life of me, don't know what the intelligence community is saying, but with Tulsi Gabbard now doing her complete, Anna Baerbock 360, also in conventional terms known as a 180, and a volte-face and about-face, where she's now this ardent Zionist, where before she was...
Like the whole team, all the team. It's just, this is, canon law.
Yeah.
We support Israel. No question, no discussion. We just support it, whatever it does. We accept, even though Israel is so deeply divided that the Israelis themselves don't know what they want because there's such a deep division about where the country is going.
Well, but that one assumption by Witkoff, or it reflects the assumption of the Trump folks. I disagree. Ray McGovern and I have this disagreement because Ray doesn't think the United States is going to follow through with it. I think they are, like you. I think they are. They're going to attack Iran. There's the only thing that they would find acceptable from Iran is it wouldn't just be an agreement that, okay, we're not going to build nukes, but they've now also got to agree that they're not going to provide any support to Hezbollah and Hamas. And Iran's not going to agree to that. On top of it, the fact that the United States continues to subvert. I have a variety of covert operations in place to subvert, destroy, dismantle Iran if it can. What do you think will be the implications of Iran's security arrangement with Russia right now in diffusing this or putting them in a position to fight back?
I talked to some from Iran who were directly involved in the nuclear talks, and they say, look, there was during that agreement, there was no undertakings given or sought by Russia about a nuclear weapon or anything of that sort. Yes, peaceful nuclear power, and perhaps the role of Russia in supplying power stations and things like that might have been discussed. But we wouldn't accept Russia as a mediator. Messenger, okay, we can pass messages, but we are not accepting Russia as a sort of mediator with us. We can pass messages through the Swiss representation in Tehran if we want to. So I just don't think, and I can't see why Russia would want to get involved with it. I mean, in that sense, in sort of persuading Iran, if you like, to undress itself from all of its defense systems and defense structures. Because, isn't this the experience that Russia has just been gone through? Yeah. Isn't this the sort of sense of being threatened that Russia has gone through? I mean, are they going to now say, well, what's good for you? I mean, it wasn't so good for us, but maybe you can put up with these threats and these military threats. I mean, Russia has been going through this. And I would have thought, the most you can expect from Russia is Russia trying to explain some of the realities to Trump. But what I think is also so lacking in, as you say, Witkoff, he's obviously a man of, certainly got emotional intelligence. Yes. And he's affable and he has, he's easy to get along with. However, I mean, he doesn't know much about, I think, the region. And, like the judge said to me in one program, and I said, I don't think they understand, the divisions in Israel. And he said, of course they don't understand that because, I mean, they are Jews from New York, and Jews from New York only know Jews from New York. And that's where they get their understanding of the region from. And I think he was right in that. It wasn't said adversarially or anything, but it was said in this way that, they get it from a very narrow sort of little circle that thinks in the same way. And so I don't think Russia will really want to be involved, but it can't be anyway, because, what's being asked of Iran is not even broadly feasible. Remember, and this is something that I don't think is so widely understood. You're dealing with the Shi'i, not with the Sunni. And the Shi'i have been, massacred and punished and had their mosques thrown down for centuries, mostly by caliphs taken over by the Sunnis against them. But these are the people that at one stage, when they were forbidden to go to the mosque, on pain of losing a finger, each time if they went to the mosque, they would have a finger cut off their hand, went to the mosque each week. And first of all, then their fingers were cut off, then their hands were cut off, and then it was going to start on the feet. And they continued to go to the mosque. These are people who have, for thousands of years, experienced pressure and threats, and others were more violent than that, and massacres, because the Shi'i were always seen as more revolutionary and more committed to some norms of justice than others. And it's a different world, different norms, different understandings. Of course, they share the Quran, but they share more than the Quran. It's a different way of thinking. And they are not, the Sunnis tend to be very literal in their understanding. They look at the Quran and they look at the Hadith and they interpret, certainly in Saudi Arabia, the Hadith are interpreted with great literalism. And the Shia are much more, if you like, about changes of consciousness.
Right.
So a famous Shia writer in about 1300s could write. And he wrote and he said, listen, O Muslims, you may be able to recite the Quran by heart. You may be able to list all of the Hadith. You may be able to know Sharia completely. And you know it by memory. You're still not a Muslim. This was Ghazali writing at the time. And he said, you're only a Muslim when that knowledge transforms your consciousness and your being. When you are transformed by having studied the Sharia, having studied the Quran, and you're transformed as a person, only then are you a true Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really the difference we're talking about between, and it extends beyond the world of Sunni Islam and Shiism, because it's really about something much more different of how you understand the world and you understand reality. And you understand reality as something that is not literal and fixed, and that it is something that is beyond the grasp of simply an immediate sort of Western mechanical division. So, I mean, this is why I've tried to put it quite simply, but because I think some of your listeners will sort of think, that all Islam is sort of very similar, but there is a big difference between Hezbollah as Shia, and so is Iran. And the Shia, if you look at the Middle East overall, not globally, because Sunnis are in the vast majority, but if you look at the Middle East, I can't give you such the exact figures, but because no one wants to count it. But it's roughly about 50-50, the Shia and the Sunni across the Middle East. Perhaps a slight majority of Shia, if you take all the Shia right through, because the Shia in Saudi Arabia as well, I think it's about 13 or 14% of the population in Saudi Arabia are Shia. And of course, in Yemen, there are Shia, and of course, in many parts of North Africa, there are Shia as well. All of that region was originally Shia in the 19th century and then changed.
Well, I draw the parallel with, for the Christians to understand it. It's like the difference between the Roman Catholics and evangelical Christians, because you can find within evangelical Christians a lot who will point to the Catholics as being a heresy, being apostates.
That's strong.
Oh, yes.
As strong as that.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And when you get into like the Mormon religion, the Mormons literally describe Rome as the great whore, the prostitute, so it's maybe when you get between the Mormons and the Roman Catholics, it's that kind of division, even though both the Mormons and the Roman Catholics profess to believe in Jesus as the Messiah. And so because that's how I've always come to understand, to categorize that dynamic. And
is it a bit, sorry to interrupt, but maybe, that's within, the bedrock of those, but I think it's even wider. I saw Schumer, who was, the leader in the House, was speaking last day, in the Senate. And he said, look, the problem, the whole problem with the Middle East is that they don't believe the Torah. Yeah. The Torah says that this land is Israel's, and they don't believe it. And that's the root and end of the problem in the Middle East. Yeah. They won't accept it, so we can't discuss anything. It can't be negotiated.
Yeah, in fact, I've come, having been raised in a, sort of in the evangelical Christian community, and growing up with the notion that the Old Testament in particular was this holy book, I've come to the point where to say, look, that book, the foundation of it, was written by Jews in exile in Babylon. And they wrote it to justify their own, they provided their own interpretation of their relationship with God. And that has become, unfortunately, the blueprint for modern foreign policy in the Middle East. Because the number of evangelical Christians that believe this nonsense, that this God, there are different gods presented in that Old Testament. The Jews maintain, oh, it's monotheism, but it's not. Particularly in Genesis 2nd chapter, where God says, let us make man in our image. Wait, who's this us and our? Okay? And the God of the Old Testament is this God that requires human sacrifice, blood sacrifice, rejects the offering of Cain because it's vegetarian. No, it's got to be something that you slaughter. It's almost demonic. It is. And that demonic culture we're now seeing reflected in the fact that the Zionists gleefully murder women and children in Gaza because they're not human. They're Amalek. They're subhuman. And, I don't know how we get out of this.
Well, I would say, you can go further back because we do have quite a lot of history about the time that the Jewish population was living in Egypt.
Yeah.
And Egypt had a very different religion. And then there is a story that may be partly mythical, but there was the story of Seth, the younger brother of Osiris, who was destined to become the pharaoh and the leader of all of Egypt. And Seth killed his brother, dismembered him, and he's sort of distributed the parts around the Nile. And then there was a big struggle. I won't get all of it, but Isis the goddess Isis managed to reassemble him, and Zeus recreated him, if you like, and Seth was expelled from Egypt. Now, there's a story that is written up in many of the Greek historians and early historians, was that when the people of Israel left Egypt, they left not because of persecution, according to those stories from that, contemporary stories from that time. They left because the familiar tale, there was a pandemic in Egypt, lots of people were dying, and they blamed foreigners for it, as usual. We have the same thing, these immigrants bring in all these diseases. Right. So they were sent out, and those earlier historians describe what happened to the Jewish people as they wandered down towards where they now claim to have come from, was that they became very angry, and they became very angry, and they created a god that was just their god, and a very, if you like, xenophobic god, didn't like any other gods. Right. And in a sense, they began worshipping Seth as the first god, if you like, the Seth who had, been opposed, if you like, to the Egyptian tradition of harmony, and the role of the leader being to create a balance between the invisible world and the visible world. And they wanted an angry, warlike god that would protect them and defeat all their enemies. And so they sort of used Seth as a model. I can't tell you if it's historically correct or not because I'm not a historian, but this is written up by many sort of famous historians. I think Herodotus was one of them, but there were several who talked about the story. And in a way, Israel is still Sethian.
Yeah. We're captive to history. Well, look, we're coming up on an hour. Let me get you to close out with, do you think there's still any chance that Witkoff would make a deal, be willing to entertain a deal with Hamas that Hamas would accept?
Oh, the basis of it has already been announced by Hamas. I don't know how much this is endorsed by, as I mentioned before, Hamas in Gaza is quite different from Hamas, the Hamas that live in five-star hotels in Qatar, who I used to know quite well. And the Gaza ones have a different, I noticed, that during that interview, Witkoff was asked, well, what do they want, Hamas? And he said, well, we gave them an offer and they didn't like it. But they made it very clear. Sheikh Yassin told me the same, and Sinwar said exactly the other. We are a national liberation movement. We're an anti-colonialist movement. It's against colonialism. It goes back to the Bandung, if you like, the Non-Aligned Movement Foundation, what it was, the sort of independence movements that took place after the Second World War, when there was a sudden shift towards trying to create independence for states. And so, I mean, that's what they're after. But, you know, they don't think that it is something that's done in a flash of pan. It's something that is a long process of liberation and anti-colonialism. And that they've said they've never been fixed. And when I used to go to Gaza, they've never been obsessed about running Gaza politically. Yes, they always had social mechanisms. I mean, you know, they looked after, you know, they were very good at social welfare. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah.
And they did that, and that was their strength, and that's why people voted for them. But they never wanted to go into party politics. This was to do partly with the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is much more sort of, it's more socialist in some respects, if you like, in that way. And so they've always said that they would be willing, providing it was which was agreed as some sort of mechanism, and was not designed to exterminate Hamas or to destroy, or to disarm them and then to kill them.
Yeah.
They won't accept that, but would they accept a system that would allow the people of Gaza to have their houses rebuilt and to try sort of gradually to move back to normal life? Yes, but they do have a different view of the world. I mean, they are not Shi'i, but they do have. And Sinwar wrote a novel in which he sort of put out very clearly his ideas that sometimes you have to make sacrifices. You have to accept pain. You have to endure sacrifices. You endure these sacrifices because for the sake of a people, not for you, but for the sake of a people. If the Palestinians are to endure, yes, our blood will be spilled. There will be pain and there will be sadness. But this is the way it involves personal sacrifice to achieve. This is wholly alien to Western hedonistic thinking and material thinking. This is why I think it's so hard for either a Witkoff or a Trump to grasp that people could actually believe that they would, that even their sons and daughters, if they're killed, this is part of the sacrifice that is necessary in order for a Palestinian people to continue to exist, for their lives and their things, and for the tradition, the bigger tradition of Islam, to be reflected by that people.
Well, sadly, I think you and I are going to be talking about this, the issues surrounding this.
No, I enjoy talking to you, Larry. It's always a pleasure. No, I don't. That part of it is not sad. The consequence where the subject matter may be sad.
Yeah.
So
and I always deeply appreciate you taking the time, but we will do this again, I promise. And thank you.
Well, I hope it works well for your audience.
It always does. You are, as Judge Napolitano says, you're a fan favorite. So thanks, Alastair. As always, Alastair brings great insight, and I much appreciate both his knowledge and his friendship. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please hit the like and subscribe button. Tell your friends, and let's try to help this channel grow. Thanks for watching. I'm Larry Johnson, and this is Countercurrents.